Let me first introduce us and introduce myself a little bit. So today I'm going to be talking about mental health in adolescence. So primarily looking at kind of teenage years for kids, maybe starting in those preteens, 11, 12, going all the way up probably to 18, 19, like those beginnings of early adulthood. We'll be looking at some common challenges that kids face and treatment considerations, things to kind of be thinking about, and also ways that we can help. And then just a little bit of background on me. So my name is Pierce, if I haven't met you before. I'm a licensed social worker. I got my master's of social work from Rutgers University, graduated during the pandemic, and have been working with in a few different fields with teenagers throughout. So I started working in substance abuse, worked with a few teenagers there, started to work in an intensive outpatient program doing group work with teens, and now I work in a private practice setting where I also see lots of teens and younger folks. So just a little bit of my background in this area. All right, what we'll cover today, I said some of this already, but we're going to look at some of the common challenges that teens face today. What are some mental health considerations that we should have when working with teens? And, thinking about, okay, what are they going through? What supports they might need? And then with that, ways to support the teens in our life. What can we be doing to make things easier for them? And then the last thing is I'll give you some resources that you can use, places that you can go if you're looking for help, or maybe your teen needs a little bit of support. All right. So I want to start off by having us take a minute to think about our teenage years. So you can close your eyes or kind of get comfortable and just kind of think about what was going on in your life at that point when you were a teenager. What stressors were there for you at this time, right? You were probably in school in one way or another, right? Maybe middle school, going into high school, or high school for a lot of our teen years. And how was school for you? Was that a safe place? Was it a place that you hated going? Did you have a lot of friends there? Did you not have a lot of friends at school? Were you involved in any sports or clubs? Did those add time to your schedule? Was that something, were you doing multiple sports multiple times during the year? Were you busy after school, busy doing other things? Were you in lots of clubs where that was also taking up some of your time? Considering all of these things. And even on top of that, did you have a job? Were you working? Did you need to make money to help support yourself or your family in some way? And then sort of less tangible things, were you trying to figure out your identity at this point? I'm going to say probably that's what a lot of teenagers struggle with, but you answer that for yourself. With that, did you feel confident in yourself? How did that impact you? And even what were cultural factors impacting you at this point, right? That can be from race or ethnicity. It can also be from politics at the time, interpersonal things that you were going through, anything like that, right? And there may be other factors. There are so many factors here. I can't possibly list them all, but these are just some to consider in thinking about what our teenage years are like. And so you can open your eyes if you had them closed. I just wanted to do this to kind of illustrate that teenagers have a lot going on. We often have this conception that, oh, teens, like, they're just teenagers. They just go to school and that's it. And, that's all they do, which isn't really true. Teens are still people. They have lives, right? They have a social life. They have all of these other things going on for them. It's not just as simple as, well, they just go to school and do homework and that's it. Because clearly, you have a lot going on in these teenage years. I'll talk about some of those considerations in a minute. And additionally, I want to highlight some of the complicating factors for teens today. right? Climate change is one thing that may sound kind of weird, but climate change is something that's really on the mind of, younger millennials and Gen Z. You know, they're really looking towards the future and saying, well, what is the planet even going to look like in even 20 or 30 years? Will things be completely different than they are now? And how do I plan for that? You know, if you're a junior or senior in high school, everybody's probably telling you to think about college, think about what you're doing after high school. But a lot of kids are thinking, well, down the line, what are things going to look like? How can you even plan for that? So that can be an additional stress um, on young people today. The current political polarization, right? And I'm not going to get political here, but most of you on here probably know my politics. But um, either way, we're seeing increasing political polarization, um, right? We're seeing blue states go farther left and red states go farther right. Um, and so there's just more and more of this divide, which is making it more difficult to live, no matter which way you see it. And right now it feels like that's just getting worse. So again, another stressor. Increasing threats around queer people. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but we are seeing higher rates of LGBT and queer identity in young people today. So in the teens we have now, Gen Z has the highest proportion of LGBT people compared to other groups, other age groups. I mean, like millennials, Gen X, all of that, which is great that they're feeling more open, more able to identify with those things. But we're also seeing increased threats around it. That kind of goes with the last one, that political polarization, where, we're seeing threats against queer clubs and bars, against drag queens, drag events, all of those things going on. So with a larger percentage of young people identifying as queer in some way, that's also something that's really on their mind. And with that in general, I don't think I put this on there, but I'm going to add in, unfortunately, just like mass shootings in general and violence in general. That is something that in America has become an unfortunate reality. We kind of have this conversation every time there's another shooting at a school, which sucks that I even say that, right? Another one. And so that's becoming a reality for teens today as well, of like just knowing that that could happen, that kind of stress being in the background. We have economic factors. So kind of similar to climate change, it feels like things are really changing right now, right? Millennials and Gen Z have some of the worst financial outlooks in a long time. So that's really stressful. How is this going to affect us? How is it going to affect these young people again, 20, 30 years down the line? Is there going to be this increased inequality of wealth where the rich are super rich and everybody else, has nothing? That's a real stress. Social media, I don't know everyone's ages here. If you're a little older, when you were growing up, you probably didn't have social media. But teens today are very in touch and in tune with social media. Pretty much everybody is on social media. So there are all kinds of effects that you get from that, right? Just from seeing other people, celebrities, but even just your friends doing things, posting things. It creates all this kind of peer pressure and thinking of like, oh, I need to look a certain way, all of those sorts of things. So that can be a big factor. And finally, COVID-19. We're 3 years out now, 3+ years from the start of COVID. But it's something to really think about when working with teenagers today, because they were impacted by COVID 3 years ago. They weren't in school for a year, probably year or more, depending. They probably lost out on a lot of opportunities for socialization, which some of them may have been coming at these really critical periods for them, where socializing is really helpful and necessary for kids. And they lost out on that, not through any fault of their own, but just because of the reality of COVID. Uh, so again, I want to highlight all of these factors just to get us thinking about what young people are facing today and the stresses that they have, even if it's not a day-to-day stress. These are all things that are kind of going on in the back of their mind and that make it harder to just be a teenager today. So again, I'm really trying to want to like dispel that notion that teens don't do anything and like they have no reason to be stressed out, because that's common. At least you hear it in like TVs and movies a lot. I think some people do really hold that belief, but clearly there are so many things that are affecting our kids and teens today. So gonna go a little nerdy for a second and just talk about some developmental theories. Just a couple real quick ones that I feel like are kind of important, good considerations to have when working with teens. So the first one is Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. So he broke it down into 8 stages. You can see those all on the side here, on the right side. And he put them all as one thing versus another. So for the age that we're looking at, these kind of teenage years of 12 to 18, he identified it as identity versus role confusion. So Erikson really saw this as a time where teens are developing their sense of self and their personal identity. They're really trying to figure out who they are, and what they want to do, right? I think this is a big thing that we see when working with teens and in teens in general, is that sense of like trying to figure out who I am, right? Trying to figure out my place in everything, what I want to do, who my friends are, like all of those kinds of things are really crucial at this age. So Erikson saw it as figuring out that identity versus confusion around that. He thought that if you weren't able to kind of establish that identity, and if you were unsure of your beliefs, that leads to insecurity and confusion. So it kind of leads to, as he puts it, that role confusion where you're not sure where you fit in. You're not sure what you want to do, where you want to go. And he sees that as kind of creating problems further down the line. And he also says that encouragement and reinforcement helps develop that identity. So giving those teens the encouragement and reinforcement that they need during these teenage years. The other theory I wanted to touch on is Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So Piaget had 4 stages of cognitive development. You can see those on the left side. I'm not going to go through all of them. They essentially kind of go through like the different ways that we sort of think and interact with the world. And he saw the final stage as what he calls the formal operational stage, which starts at age 12 and goes up. And so in this formal operational stage, it's when you start getting into more theoretical, hypothetical, and abstract thinking and logic. So it's when you're really developing those critical thinking skills for the first time, really having to think on your own, and think about everything that's going on around you. He also sees it as being able to apply concepts from one context into another. So this little illustration over here sort of, shows the cup half empty versus half full thing, right? You're kind of able to engage in those sort of like logical debates at this point. And so I bring this up because, obviously our teens are kind of new to this sort of thing. And so they're, they might be struggling, or, when we talk about critical thinking in schools, we're really thinking about like developing this sort of thinking and logic and reasoning. So that can also be important to keep in mind where teens may not have fully developed that yet. but they might just need some help and encouragement in doing so. All right, so I'm going to give some statistics on mental health in adolescents. This is kind of the boring part where I will give you statistics, but I feel like they're important, which is why I want to include them. So these statistics are all from the 2022 National Healthcare Quality and Disparities Report, which is something that I forget which agency it is, but that the government does every year, looking kind of at the past year, at the sort of trends in quality and disparities. So in the 2022 study, they found that 20% of children and young people from 3 to 17 have a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. So that seems like a broad category, but that's essentially what we're thinking about, and what we're looking at. For me as a therapist, right, I'm looking at the DSM. Those are all mental, emotional, developmental, and behavioral things. And so 20% is a big percentage. That's a fifth of kids from ages 3 to 17. Additionally, they found in 2020 that suicide was the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 14, and the third leading cause for people ages 15 to 24. So I was really shocked by that. You think there'd be some sort of disease or something. So suicide is a really big leading cause of death for our teenagers. I kind of wish that the age range was more like 10 to 18 to get a better idea. But even still, it being the second and third leading cause of death really shows a lot. And additionally, I didn't write this down on here, but this study also found that an estimated 70 to 80% of kids with mental health disorders go without care for one reason or another, whether that be their family not being able to afford it, them not having a supportive family, nobody in their life noticing it. There's a lot of factors that can go in there. But, so it's really, I hope, starting to paint this picture of how mental health is affecting our young people. We have a fifth of children with some sort of mental health problem going on, and 70 to 80% of them aren't getting care for it, which is leading to suicide being one of the leading causes of death for teenagers. They also found that 15% of adolescents from 12 to 17 had a major depressive episode in 2018 to 2019. So again, that's depression and anxiety are pretty common, but that's still a huge percentage, and this isn't necessarily saying that they were diagnosed with major depressive disorder, but they had at least one depressive episode, which a depressive episode isn't something that just lasts for a few days. It's typically something that lasts for weeks or months. So, considering 15% of kids for some period for weeks or months were mentally affected, depressed, unable to kind of engage how they regularly would. And then in 2016 to 2019, they found that 9.8% of adolescents were diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, 9.4% with anxiety, and 8.9% with a behavioral diagnosis. So again, although these aren't huge percentages, I think that that's still almost, 9.8, 9.4% is close to 10% of kids. So that's 1 in 10 kids that's dealing with one of these, with either attention deficit disorder, anxiety, depression, or some combination of them, right? Because we often know that these things go hand in hand, right? Depression and anxiety are very classically paired together. And then other diagnoses like ADHD can make those things worse or also play into that. So a lot of kids may be affected by multiple of these. And then again, 70 to 80% of them aren't getting the care that they need. All right, and then some other considerations that I want to put in here. Eating disorders. Eating disorders are, of course, something that affect a lot of young people. We primarily think of them affecting young girls. They also affect young boys as well. Again, there are a lot of factors that go into this. I talked before about social media, right? That's definitely having more of an impact, constantly seeing, skinny celebrities that have tons and tons of money to do all these procedures and make themselves look nice. Right, that's great for them, but then it's putting this impression on young people that they need to look that way, that they need to be doing all of these things just like these celebrities are. And for young boys, there's also a lot of pressure from sports. Boys are more likely to be involved in sports with weight classes. And there's also just pressure similarly for boys to look a certain way, have a certain amount of muscle, etc. And so a meta-analysis of studies that were conducted from 2000 to 2018 found that the lifetime chances of having an eating disorder were 8.4% for females and 2.2% for males. I don't love the gendered breakdown, but it's hard to find one that doesn't include that. And it does affect people who are assigned female at birth more than people who are assigned male at birth. It was also hard to find numbers on this for teens specifically, so that's why I put the lifetime chances here. Knowing that a lot of people, they start to develop this or experience eating disorders in their teenage years. And a lot of times they can go unnoticed. It can be really hard to notice an eating disorder in a young person. We often think of like really bad anorexia or bulimia when we think of eating disorders, but they may not be that obvious. There can be a lot of more subtle signs that are really easy to overlook. Sometimes there are eating disorders like avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder, where it may just look like, this kid's a really picky eater. That's when they only take and eat certain foods or have a hard time eating foods and want to obviously restrict the food that they're taking in. So it may just seem like, oh, they don't have a big appetite, they're a really picky eater, but there might be more going on there, and it can be really hard to identify that. Also, of course, I had to touch on queer identity. So of schools surveyed in the 2021 Youth Risk Behavior Survey, 3.2% of adolescents identified as gay or lesbian, 11.9% as bisexual, and 9% as questioning. So, like I said before, and these were high schools that were surveyed in this 2021 study. I was really surprised by the high percentage of kids who identified as questioning. 9%, I thought it would be more like 9% kids identifying as gay or lesbian, and something like 2 or 3% identifying as questioning. But again, this ties back into what I was saying before about identity, where kids are figuring out their identities at this time, going back to Erickson's theory, right? That it's this identity versus confusion time of their lives. And I think with social media and the internet, kids are having way more exposure to these queer identities than we used to have, right? Before social media, before the internet was something that was so accessible. You often wouldn't see queer people around, or you may not hear about queer identity for many years. But teens have all of that at their fingertips now. And so a lot of them are trying to figure out where they fit into that, trying to figure out, okay, am I gay? Do I like the same sex? Do I still like the opposite sex? And that's not even considering gender. Is there a gender identity aspect to that? Is that something for them to consider? So again, just tying together this picture of, kids really trying to figure themselves out, and needing support in doing so. Then the last thing I wanted to mention here was race and ethnicity, um, particularly with minority stress theory. So very quick explanation of minority stress theory, is essentially it's one way to help explain why many minority groups have worse health outcomes than their non-minority peers. So just for example, I know that queer youth have much higher rates of suicide attempts, depression, anxiety, just mental health disorders in general. So minority stress theory says that because of the stress of living as a minority in our current day and age, all of that stress kind of adds up and helps explain these worse health outcomes. So, like I said earlier, for queer people, right now there's rising threats against transgender people, especially, but just queer people in general. And so that's something that's going to weigh on queer people, right? It's something that's really on our minds. It's something that can ultimately affect our health. And that goes for pretty much any minority group. And minority stress theory was originally talked about, it was talked about in regards to Black people and how they are affected by the racism around them and those sort of institutional and individual racist factors. And so, of course, it's been much more widely applied, obviously, since then. But that's just something else to consider, right? And especially if you're working with a student who's a minority in your school, right? If you're working with a Black student in a predominantly white school, they may be feeling those effects much more. And so part of that can be thinking, okay, how can I support them specifically? What kind of space or things, might they need? What kind of experiences might they be having? So these are just all kind of, the statistics and things to be thinking about. All right. So hopefully, I've got you thinking enough and you're like, okay, Pierce, this is all great and a little depressing and sad. How can I actually support the teens in my life? So I want to give you a few ways that you can really start to do that. So the first thing is modeling healthy management of emotions. This may seem a little odd, right? You may be expecting like talk to them and that sort of thing. And I will talk about that too. But I wanted to put this first because if you have kids or you work with kids a lot, then modeling healthy management of your emotions is what they're going to learn from, right? If you don't have healthy management of your emotions, right, and you just kind of let things build up, build up, build up, and then you snap and you yell at them, that's what they're going to know. They're going to see that, especially if you're a parent, growing up with that, like your kids learn a lot from you, obviously, even as teenagers. They really learn from us. And also, teens can tell when something is off, right? Like you may be having a really bad day, be really like pissed off, and you may say, no, everything's fine to them. But they know, they're not dumb. Teens have exceptionally good, at least I found in my work with teens. And so being honest with them and modeling those healthy management of emotions. And that can look a lot of different ways. We often think about sort of window of tolerance in therapy. So essentially the idea is, you have your baseline and you have a certain window above and below that baseline where emotions are kind of tolerable, right? Like, okay, if, a coworker does something annoying, that kind of puts you above that baseline a little bit. You're a little annoyed. Um, but you can manage that, right? And people have different windows of tolerance. But again, keeping ourselves within our window of tolerance is really important with teenagers. Um, and on the right here are just a few things, right? These are some pretty common coping skills that we talk about. I won't go through all of them, but whatever works for you is great. That's what I always say with coping skills. If it works, if it helps de-stress you, that's awesome. And so just modeling that with teenagers can be really important. So again, they learn from that, and they often may not see adults doing that, right? So it might be refreshing for them to see like, oh, okay, this person in my life is actually modeling emotions, right? Saying like, okay, I need a minute. I'm going to go do this, whatever that might be for you in order to calm down or whatever it is, right? And I also acknowledge things aren't always that black and white and simple. But again, that general idea of modeling that management of our emotions. All right, number 2, providing space and encourage them to share their feelings and validating them too. Again, teens may not want to share, they again are figuring out their identities. They may feel like talking to their parents or an adult is dumb. But also most teens probably have at least 1 or 2 adults in their life who they feel comfortable with, right? And so if you're a parent, that might not necessarily be you, but you might be that person for another teenager who they really trust. So making sure to kind of give them opportunities, providing them that space, and letting them know that they can share things with you is really important. And also not forcing them to share things with you, right? Because then they're never going to share anything else with you. You want to give them that space and let them take it if they need it. And if they don't, then that's okay. You can kind of back off. It can be good to look for times to talk to them, right? If it's your kids, I know there's a classic thing of asking them how their day was when they get home from school, right? That can be good. Maybe they don't want to talk then. Maybe over dinner or something like that. And then I just want to touch on the validation part because it can be really important to validate how kids are feeling. Teens, I should say, are feeling. I mean, kids too, but I'm not talking specifically about young kids right now. Because, I feel like a lot of teens have that experience of talking to their parents, talking to an adult in their life, and just getting completely shut down and told like, oh, you can't be feeling that, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just going to make them never want to talk to you again. So it's really important to validate them and let them know that, like, yeah, that is a real struggle, even if it's something like, they have a test coming up tomorrow. They also had soccer practice until 9 p.m. and now they're stressed, right? Like, that's still a legitimate stress in their life at that point. And validating that can be really important. And also with that, not just jumping to giving advice. I think as adults, we often want to jump to give advice because we see ourselves as older and wiser, and we probably are in a lot of ways, but also we're humans and we may not always want that. Sometimes we might just want to vent our feelings and, just let them out. And teens should absolutely have their space to do that as well. It can be good to ask them, like, do you want advice or not? And that kind of thing. So yes, this is the talking to them part I mentioned before. All right, and then kind of with this last one, respect them and take them seriously. I think because again, we see teens as younger, and they still have a lot of learning and growing to do, right? Especially if they're in those younger teenage years. We know there's a huge difference between 13 and 14 and 18 years old. But we still have to respect them and take them seriously, right? I feel like there's often in my work with teenagers, at least anecdotally, I often see parents not taking their kids seriously, not really listening to their kids when their kids need to be listened to. Because teenagers are really different than kids. Like I said before, they have excellent, and so even as a, if you're their parent, they can kind of tell if you're being fake or, you're not really giving them that respect. They're also looking to kind of become their own person at this point, like I talked about before. And so respecting them and kind of giving them that space can be really important in developing that identity. I'll talk a little bit later about healthy decisions and such, but that also comes into play here, giving them that space reasonably, knowing when you may need to jump in, but giving them some of that trust. So, guiding them where they may need it or when they ask for it, if you're able to develop that relationship where they come to you and ask for advice, that's awesome. So guiding them when they need it. And it's also important to know that they might be pulling away from parents more, right? As kids kind of get into their preteen years and teenage years, they tend to start spending less time with the family, more time with friends. And so again, it's really important to let them do that, not, make them feel like they need to be spending all their time with the family. Because again, at this point, they're really developing their own identity, and they're going to want to do their own thing. So respecting them and taking that seriously can go a long way. It can help them feel more autonomy, which is really important for that growth and development, so they can start to learn to do things on their own. Involve them in decisions about rules. So this one feels a little different than the others, but I wanted to put this in here because often we put all these rules on our kids and teens, and especially as they get older, right? I talked about that cognitive development earlier where they're starting to get more of those critical thinking skills. They're going to be able to start looking at these rules and seeing like, well, wait, why is my curfew 9 p.m.? Like, why can't it be 10 or 11? I'm 16, 17 years old. They may start thinking about those sorts of things. And so involving them in those decisions makes them more likely to comply with them and really understand that, right? If you just sort of put an arbitrary rule on them, they don't understand it, don't understand where that rule is coming from, they're less likely to follow it. That may just go for people in general, but it's especially true for teenagers, where, again, they're trying to figure things out, trying to navigate things. So if they think that something's dumb, they're just not going to obey it, right? Like so many kids now with the what's it called, GDL laws with, your provisionary license, you can only have one person in the car, right? So many teenagers ignore that because they don't see the point in it, right? And so, of course, that's obviously kind of a macro level scale thing. But even in the house or in the classroom, or in the sort of group that you're in with them, working with them, not against them, to make rules can go a long way. It can really help them to both feel involved in that process and then again, make them more likely to actually follow those rules. And of course, certain rules may be necessary. You may need to put your foot down on certain things. But at the same time, teens are going to learn to handle themselves and kind of make mistakes and learn on their own. So finally, my last piece of advice for helping to support teens is support healthy risk taking. Of course, this is a big thing with LMTI, but it goes for teens especially. Because again, like I said, this is a time of kind of experimentation for teenagers. They're really looking to try different things and figure out where they want to fit in. So experimenting with their hair, clothing, appearance, anything like that is all normal and healthy. Again, within reason, but those kind of things should be supported. Ultimately, hair grows back. You can change clothing, etc. And so supporting that instead of being an antagonist to that can go a long way. Again, and just having that trust and that rapport with teens. Additionally, it gives them confidence to do something they might not normally do. If you're there to support them and not fight against them when they want to do something, then it gives them more confidence. It allows them to feel better in themselves, which builds their confidence and that identity, all of those good things that we talked about earlier. And of course, there may be times where you need to intervene, right? So we're talking about healthy risk taking, right? Dyeing your hair, performing in the talent show, right? All healthy risks. Doing something dumb with their friends may not be a healthy risk. You may need to jump in there. But again, this is all within reason. And so finally, I just wanted to give some resources to help out with, mental health things, all of that. Of course, the first things are lovely LMTI's resources page on their website. They have a really good list of resources, way more than I could put here. So if you're looking for something specific, you can go there. They have a ton of stuff broken down by different sections, a lot of lifelines, some of which I've put here, which I'll talk about in a second, and lots of different organizations doing different great things. I want to give a few things to help find resources in your area. Findhelp.org is a big one. They can help connect you with organizations or mental health professionals in the area. Same with nj211.org. I think most states and areas have their own 211, so even if it's not an NJ. Yeah, similarly, they have a lot of like food pantries, shelters. They have it broken down into several different categories, and you can click on that category and put in your address, and it will show you things around you. So that can be really helpful when looking for finding support. I also put here NEDA's website. Let's see how you pronounce it. NEDA, NEDA. NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association. They have a lot of great resources. They also have links to providers and mental health professionals that can help with eating disorders specifically. They also have a screening tool on their website that can be really good to help kind of assess if you're, teen or someone in your life does have something going on. And then last but not least, I wanted to put a few lifelines on here. Of course, the first is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which I think still has a longer number too, but you can also just dial 988 now to see more of that. There's the Trans Lifeline, which I wanted to include. They have a pretty radical stance on not deploying police or emergency services without the person's consent. Not that it is a huge percentage of the time that other lifelines do that. It's really a small handful of calls that get called in where police may be mobilized in response to a mental health crisis. But the Trans Lifeline knows that for transgender and queer people in general, interactions with police are not very comfortable. And so they never involuntarily dispatch police. So I wanted to put that. And then finally, the Trevor Project, which we all probably know, has a lot of great resources, has their own chat and phone lines for gay, LGBT, queer people and teens specifically.